Hey guys, LevelCap here, and today we're taking a look at the top 10 worst video games based on movies. Now, if we're being totally honest, there's probably been thousands of video games based on movies that just aren't very good. But we're going to try and whittle that number down to 10 of the absolute worst throughout history. Starting off with number 10, we have Enter the Matrix. Back in the early 2000s, The Matrix was the hottest sci-fi franchise around. The original movie was both incredibly successful and massively influential. It really helped to define the action sci-fi genre in film, TV, and even video games. So it sounds like a Matrix video game should have been a great idea. Unfortunately, the first attempt at one, Enter the Matrix, was not so great. Released on the same month as The Matrix Reloaded, the game is notorious for its clunky gameplay and extending the film franchise's universe with live-action scenes. Reviewers felt that the game was an unfinished mess and that the Reloaded movie actually suffered from having scenes cut from it for the sake of putting them into the video game. And unfortunately, one of the main selling points of the whole Matrix franchise and what should have been great in a video game, bullet time, was actually done much better from its competition Max Payne. That game came out 2 years prior, capitalized on the iconic bullet time effect from The Matrix, and was an incredibly well-crafted game. Enter the Matrix ironically looked like a cheap Max Payne knockoff by comparison. Number 9 on the list is the 1987 Star Wars Nintendo Entertainment System game. It's based on A New Hope and was released exclusively in Japan, in case you're wondering why you may have never heard of it. Like many Star Wars games of the era, it tried to replicate the visuals and music of the movies. However, the gameplay itself has little to do with Star Wars the movie at all, and the creative liberties that the game developers take are just, well, frankly amazing. For example, at the end of every level, for whatever reason, you fight Darth Vader, and every time you hit him, at least the first hit in the battle, he randomly transforms into a different animal. For example, a scorpion. Because I remember that scene in Star Wars when Darth Vader turns into a scorpion for that crazy twist. Remember that big crazy plot twist where Darth Vader's actually... Yeah, it's absolutely bananas. And the rest of the gameplay itself has almost nothing to do with Star Wars, as it's just a generic platformer as you go through environments filled with random creatures that, as far as I can tell, were never in the Star Wars universe. You do see stormtroopers from time to time, but for the most part, it's all over the place. Of course, the game wouldn't be complete without the final medal ceremony, and dear God, those sprites. The one thing that the game does get right is giving Chewie a medal for helping destroy the Death Star. The best part though is that Han doesn't get a medal for whatever reason. Now, there's been a lot of bad Star Wars games, but this one takes the cake for deviating wildly from the source material to just a bizarre effect, while also being an overly difficult and poorly crafted game overall. Number 8 on this list was a game that I had to double check that it wasn't actually fake. Believe it or not, they actually made a movie tie-in game for the 2004 Catwoman. With a Rotten Tomatoes score of 9%, it's considered one of the worst superhero movies ever made, and certainly a low point for the career of its title star, Halle Berry. As for the game, it is real. Halle Berry's likeness was replicated for the game to dubious effect, but Jennifer Hale provided the voice acting. The gameplay is somewhere between Prince of Persia and Crash Bandicoot. The game makes heavy use of the Resident Evil style tank controls as well, leading to fights and platforming that's both generic and frustrating. You're supposed to be an acrobatic fighting machine, but feel like a confused Indiana Jones trying to whip his way through the streets of some unnamed city. Now, for a movie tie-in game, especially one in the early 2000s, Catwoman has decent visuals. It doesn't look nearly as slapped together as some of the other titles on this list, but things really tend to fall apart in the cutscenes. The janky animations and stiff character models are put on full display. They're awkwardly hilarious and distract from the game's presentation as an action platformer. And what landed Catwoman on this list isn't that it was just a bad game, but that it was a bad game based on an equally bad, if not worse, movie. I can only imagine being a game developer for Catwoman when you're getting sneak peeks of the final film and thinking, oh God, this is going to be awful. At number 7, we have the 2008's Iron Man game. It's based on the first Iron Man movie and launched the exact same day. It also launched at a time where putting your game on every console meant porting it at least 6 different times. And despite sporting Robert Downey Jr. and Terrence Howard reprising their roles from the movie, the game was an epic disaster. Honestly, I don't know how you managed to make Iron Man look like Homer Simpson painted silver, but they somehow did it. Now, the likeness of the actors is actually pretty decent, but the poor lip syncing and bad lighting makes them look like unholy rejects from the uncanny valley. And of course, the gameplay is painfully generic. Where things truly go sideways for Iron Man is the Wii version. It has a whopping 15% out of 100 review score on the Nintendo Magazine website, which headlines the review with, "Is this the worst Wii game of all time?" The review then goes on to say that the game resembles a 4-year-old's attempt at making a Lego robot before getting bored and throwing it in the mud. Now, unfortunately for the Wii, it was notable for often featuring the worst possible port of any given game, but Iron Man takes the cake as one of the highest profile stinkers on the platform. The fact that it was a direct tie-in with the movie that essentially launched the MCU is just really unfortunate. Number 6 is another game about a guy in a metal suit. This time around, it's the 2003 ROBOCOP game. Even by 2003 standards, ROBOCOP was clunky and ugly. The UI tries to replicate the film's iconic POV HUD, but it looks unfinished and distracting. Many of the game's sounds and visual effects are just completely broken. But all that takes a backseat to the gameplay, which is of course the game's biggest issue. ROBOCOP has an auto lock-on mode that's supposed to kill any selected targets, but if you trigger the lock-on and the enemy is behind cover, ROBOCOP will just unload all of his available ammo without killing them. He also doesn't aim for the head. You might be thinking, well, does he aim at center mass? Nope. He aims for the crotch, pretty much 100% of the time in this mode. The levels are also awful. Despite the game's heads-up display constantly highlighting enemies and interactive objects, there's no waypoint markers to follow. So you end up lost in the maze-like levels, missing points of interest required to progress. There's also no checkpoint save system in the game, so if you die, well, you've got to start the level all over again. At number 5 on the list, we have Spider-Man 3. Much like the movie it's based on, reviews are pretty dire. It launched in 2007, about a year after the PlayStation 3 hit the shelves, and like many games of this era, you get an almost entirely different game depending on what platform you bought it for. The PlayStation 2, Wii, and PSP versions were developed by a completely different developer. Though these versions reused many assets from the proper PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 versions of the game, it had a lot of missing content and features. That being said, things really weren't that much better on the next-gen platforms. It was extremely buggy and ugly, especially considering that these consoles were capable of much more. You'd be forgiven for thinking that this was footage of Gary's mod Machinima, but this is actually what the real game is like. The sad thing is, the previous games in the franchise were pretty well regarded and handled by the same developer, Treyarch. Spider-Man 2 was almost universally praised as an incredibly faithful and well-made adaptation of the film. So to see the downward spiral in quality happen so suddenly raises all sorts of questions. Number 4 on this list is the epic vampire disaster known as Blade 2. Now, at first glance, you might think this is the game version of the movie, but it actually serves as a sequel to the film. It's an action brawler that features a 360-degree combat system. And instead of controlling what moves your character does, you just point at what direction you want to attack, and he automatically does whatever moves he wants in that direction. Combining that with the fact that Blade's iconic sword is only used when you fill the rage meter, the combat in the game felt like it basically lacked everything you might want from a Blade action game. Wesley Snipes brought his karate chops to the Blade films. His fight scenes and the way he embodied the character are pretty much the main attraction of the franchise, so for the game to reduce the action and personality of the films to a contrived and boring gimmick really sucks the life out of it. Get it? Because he's like a vampire and he's... Okay, yeah, you guys get it. The development of Blade 2 was rushed to hit the movie's September 2002 DVD release deadline. It was a commercial failure, selling less than 500,000 units, and that failure haunted the developer Muckyfoot to the grave as the company closed shop the following year. Number 3 on the list is a game based on a movie that's based on a game. Street Fighter the movie, the game, was released for PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn in 1995. It was based on the live-action movie from 1994, and it's a blight on the Street Fighter franchise's record. While a proper arcade game was also released as a movie tie-in, the home console version was basically a totally different game. It was actually mostly a port of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, Turbo is one of the most beloved fighting games of all time and is still played competitively to this day. Surely a port couldn't be that bad. Well, it was. Street Fighter the movie features poorly digitized versions of the film's characters, lousy frame rate, imbalanced fight mechanics, bad animations, and every other issue you can think of that would hurt a fighting game. These games demand a high degree of polish, accuracy, and repeatability. If you have to hit a combo with extremely specific timing, but the game's frame rate fluctuates so wildly that the timing for that combo is inconsistent, it basically becomes impossible to play the game well. And that's pretty much the story of Street Fighter the movie, the game, in a nutshell. Now, many of the games on this list are from the early 2000s. That was a dark time for movie game tie-ins. Perhaps if we fast forward to, say, 2014, things will get better. Well, certainly not for all the games. At number 2, we have RAMBO the video game. This is one of the ugliest, most slapped together looking games of all time. It's an arcade rail shooter where you control Sly Stone's second most famous character, John Rambo. The game is basically a mashup of the first 3 movies and a shipping container of bad ideas. Shooters on rails had effectively died after the Nintendo Wii beat them into submission with its janky motion controllers. Graphically, the game also harkened back to the Wii days. The character models and animations were laughable at best, with Rambo looking like a poorly proportioned, bizarro world interpretation of the 80s action icon. And then of course there's the actual gameplay. Every gunfight is a weird ballet of brain-dead AI, frustrating quick-time event sequences, clumsy cover controls, and an on-rails camera that just sucks all the tension out of getting shot at by enemies as it just pans them out of frame. You'll be surrounded by enemies on all sides, only for the camera to swing around in a new direction, hiding huge groups of enemies while you only take damage from the ones in view. To add insult to injury, much of the original audio from the movies is used for the game's dialogue. So the quality of the audio and the way the characters sound can vary dramatically from one line to the next. All things considered, Rambo the video game looks and plays like a fan-made asset flip title from the dark underbelly of Steam's early access program. Finally, the number 1 spot on this list belongs to a game that quite literally crashed the game industry and has become legend for it. E.T. the Extra-Terrestrial was one of the first legitimate movie tie-in games ever. It launched for the Atari in December of 1982. Atari expected the game to sell like hotcakes and ordered over 3 million units to be produced in anticipation. Early launch figures seemed good. They weren't exactly meeting expectations, but it was still one of the top-selling holiday titles of the year. Then the reviews started coming in. The game was slammed for its incomprehensible presentation, broken gameplay, and total lack of basically any redeeming features whatsoever. Most of the gameplay consisted of constantly falling down almost unavoidable pits while you're chased by generic human-like characters. The goal of the game seems to be to collect items in the level, but there's nothing explaining why they're important. The only way to find out how to play the game was by reading the instruction manual that it came with. But even then, the actual gameplay was so clunky and broken that knowing how to play just didn't really help you. It also certainly didn't help that the game barely looked like the movie at all. The visuals were presented mostly in shades of green, including E.T. himself. Ironically, the most colorful characters are the people chasing you. The gameplay didn't borrow much from the movie either. You couldn't heal people or move objects like E.T. did in the movie. All you can really do is shuffle around and elongate E.T.'s neck to float out of the pits. The only thing E.T. really had going for it was the name on the box, and that certainly wasn't enough to save it. E.T. managed to sell around 1.5 million copies, but widespread returns and price reductions made the game a commercial disaster for Atari. They ended up burying nearly 1 million unsold cartridges in a landfill because they couldn't afford to get rid of them in any other way. E.T.'s failure is considered one of the key events that caused the video game industry to collapse in 1983. Atari was the biggest name in home console gaming at the time, but PCs were on the rise and Atari failed to adapt. Atari closed their doors in 1983 as the video game industry crashed around them. It's estimated that gaming revenue dropped 97% across the entire industry that year. Today, E.T. is regarded as one of the worst games ever made, and it's not surprising considering it was made in 5 weeks by one programmer and his assistant. Kinda crazy to think about how much the game industry has changed since then. Anyway, that wraps it up for this top 10 list. As always, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think of this list in the comments down below, if there's any games you think should have been up here. And as always, I'll see you next time. This is LevelCap signing off.